Hello and welcome to the Oxford German Classic podcast. My name is Santhia Velasco Kittlaus. I'm a doctoral candidate in German literature here at Oxford, and I also coordinate what we call A German Classic, our essay competition for sixth formers. We're going to talk about this year's set text, Schiller's Die Räuber, today, and I'm very happy to have Steffi and Ian with me here as my guests. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
So, what brought you to Oxford?
I first came to Oxford quite recently, actually, to work on a project on the writer Franz Kafka, who was the subject of last year's Oxford Classic Prize. And before that, I was a stipendiary researcher at the German Literature Archive in Marbach am Neckar, where Friedrich Schiller, the subject of this year's prize, was born. And before that, I worked at several universities in Germany and in the UK. And a long time ago, I was actually also a school teacher of German. So basically also my current research looks at how we remember writers of the past today. And so I think Kafka and Schiller are great examples of that.
I came to Oxford to work in the Bodleian Libraries on collection research and literary provenance. And in the autumn, I'll be starting as the incoming Sylvia Nash Fellow at the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Society at the School of Advanced Study in London. Previously, I was a research associate at the German Literature Archive in Marbach, that's been mentioned. And the archive in Marbach holds a large collection of Schiller artifacts and manuscripts. And during my time there, I also co-edited 2 volumes on Schiller's theatre practices and rhetorics.
Excellent, thank you. What makes studying literature so interesting? What is it? Why do we do it?
For me, it started with foreign languages. When I was at school, I was obsessed with learning foreign languages. I started with French and picked up German. And then when I got to university, I started Spanish from scratch as well. And I had always read whatever I could get my hands on as a kid. And so when I started learning a foreign language, I then went to that language's culture. So it's literature, it's music, it's film. And that's still basically what I'm doing today, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So I've always loved stories. I think a need for storytelling is quite universal. But for me personally, it also helped with language skills and language learning because I was never very good at lists of vocabulary and grammar tables and such. But as soon as I could say enough and could read enough, understand enough to read something, to have a narrative, plot, characters, that's what kept me going, and that's what I found really exciting.
Thank you. We have a shared passion here, I think. Who was Schiller?
It's a big question, but maybe we could start with some biography. As we said earlier, he was born in a place called Marbach am Neckar, a very small village in rural Baden-Württemberg, so in the southwest of Germany. He was born there in 1759, and he grew up with 5 sisters and was living in the city of Ludwigsburg, where his father worked as a court gardener, an officer for the Duke Karl Eugen of Württemberg. When he was 13, Schiller entered the Karlsschule, which is located on a place on a hill called Solitude in Stuttgart, which gives you a bit of an idea of the kind of place it was. He started studying law, but then switched to medicine, trained as an army doctor, military doctor. And I think that had quite an influence on how he presents bodies and how he presents people's minds as well in a play like Die Räuber. Wasn't, I think, by our standards anyway, a nice place to go to school. I think he suffered quite a lot under the strict military drill that prevailed at the time in the Karlsschule, which was actually still called a military academy at the time. Schiller finished his medical studies, but he was quite reluctant to serve under this Duke Karl Eugen. But during his time at the Karlsschule, he had actually been writing the text of Die Räuber in secret. Not least because, as we might get into later, it's the kind of play that might push back against quite conservative or disciplinarian institutions. It's a play that dreams of rebellion. It's full of grand gestures of heroic defiance. But it's also interesting to say, really, that when he left the Karlsschule, finally at the age of 21, he didn't take much with him, but he did take the manuscript of Die Räuber that he'd written in secret with him when he left.
So why is Schiller such a big name in German literature, and how has this been passed on over the centuries?
So Schiller was incredibly productive as a writer during his lifetime. He only lived to be 45, but even before then, he had written a large number of plays, which were all very successful. He also collaborated for many years with Goethe, who was one of the other renowned authors, widely read authors already at that point, and continued to be so. And I think, so another aspect is, of course, that he died fairly young. And I think if somebody has such an incredibly career and then passes away at an early age, there is always this fascination, this poignant sense of loss, this idea of what could they have done if they had more years. Another aspect I think that's very important is that at that time, Germany was not a unified nation in the terms of how we understand it today. It was a conglomerate of states with their own laws, with their own rulers, but there was very much a push for unification, which then happened, but it took, I wouldn't say over a century. But every time, so even after he passed away, every time there was a push for this process, it was easy to link this back to Schiller's writing, which was full of ideas about freedom, about citizenship, about educating citizens, and very, very idealistic, very revolutionary in many ways. So I think that's something that has contributed to make him, he's often referred to as the Nationaldichter, the national poet of Germany. So I think that helped. But the other thing that I personally find very fascinating is that during his lifetime and after his death, throughout the 19th century, there was a strong craving, a sort of a craze for any material, any artifacts that connected to him, like, and his writing physically. So even before he died, people were making busts of him, and there's like portraits of him and such. But after he passed away, people were then collecting locks of his hair, or sometimes hair that they thought belonged to him, or items from his household that had this, that he had touched or that he had seen, and so on and so forth. He was a smoker. People collected his pipes and his snuff box, which is connected to his writing, in that there's a portrait of him where he sort of leaning on one of his snuff boxes as clearly depicted as a poet. So it's kind of this poetic source of inspiration for him. But yeah, people wanted that. But then the most coveted pieces, of course, were pieces of his writing, something that he had written, letters, manuscripts, and so forth. And there was such a demand for it. People were writing to his friends, to his family, and they had so many requests that they ended up cutting individual sentences out of his letters, out of his manuscripts, so that it could satisfy this demand, which obviously from today's point of view is a very sad way of preserving someone's sort of writing. But that's what happened. And so there was, it even got to the point about 50 years after he passed away, there was such a demand for it and not much to go around, because Schiller had a habit of destroying his materials. Once he was done with a manuscript, once it was printed and published, he would destroy it, burn it. And so there was a market gap, and one man in Weimar filled it by forging a lot of Schiller manuscripts, and he produced, within a short time span, hundreds and hundreds of Schiller forgeries and sold them quite widely. The museum, the Goethe and Schiller Museum in Weimar actually last year had an exhibition on Schiller forgeries, which still exist and are still in institutions. So yes, I think that just goes to show a great demand for sort of physical closeness to Schiller, which was particularly strong in the 19th century.
And it's still attractive, I assume, yeah. To come back to our set text, could you tell us a little bit more about Die Räuber?
Yes, so I think one of the key things to say about this play, if it doesn't make me sound too old, is that it is a young person's play. It was written when Schiller was 19 years old, or at least that's the age he was when he started writing it. And I think I'm right in saying that when it was written, it was actually a play he wanted studied in schools. You know, he wanted young people to read this. So in that sense, it's a really compelling choice, I think, for the prize this year. Also, not to overstate the case, I wouldn't want to do that at all, but we are filming this on election day in the United Kingdom, and it's difficult to deny that we're living through a time of political upheaval, not just here, but in many places, where people are desiring perhaps change to the status quo or not. So the ways that the play grapples with questions of change and potential rebellion or revolution have suddenly, unexpectedly perhaps, acquired a new urgency. In any case, the drama depicts a rivalry between two siblings, two sons of accounts. On the one hand, you have the freedom-loving, intelligent Karl, who's well-loved by his father. On the other hand, the cold and calculating brother Franz, who's deprived of affection and is jealous of Karl and wants to seize his inheritance. The central dynamic of the play really is, I think, this conflict and tension between the brothers, but also between reason and emotion, between law and freedom. It's a really passionate play. It's a really frustrated play in many ways. It's full of passion and frustration. But it's also really bookish in a way, in the sense that you really have a sense this is a text written by a young writer who's read a lot of other texts that have influenced him. You know, there are parts of the Bible in there, you know, inspiration from Shakespeare in many ways. I think Richard III is a really sort of key text, actually, to think about here. And well, you could even say that there are many elements of the play that aren't actually new, but what Schiller does is stitch these elements together, bring them together, weave them together, whichever metaphor you'd like to think with, into something new. So creating something new out of what he's read and what's influenced him. It's an imaginative play. It's intelligent. It's quite sensitive, I think. It feels pretty modern, actually. The language sort of swings from lofty rhetoric to student slang. And also Schiller kind of threw aside the rule book for drama conventions, really. So the Greek philosopher Aristotle, for example, would talk about what often get called the classical unities, so unities of action, unity of place, and unity of time, which basically means a play should have a single action, so a single plot that happens in a single place in a single day. And if you've read the play, you know that Schiller basically sort of tears up the rule book and just does away with all of these conventions. Yeah, so I think he really does push the boundaries of theatre. Right?
Yeah, no, and I think people found it shocking at the time in some ways. So, I mean, it's quite an energetic play that shows violence on stage, maybe to a degree that it hadn't happened before. It is bold in the way that it questions the legitimacy of tyrannical rulers, but also it has great complexities in the relationship it shows between the brothers and the father, but generally also just a sense that a sort of balance is out of order, which they spoke to people. I think another thing worth noting is that we say the play, but there are actually quite a few versions of this play because it was intended as to be read first and foremost. It is, it's a reading drama in the way it still follows the conventions of dramatic conventions, but it was intended to be read. It has quite a lot of stage directions in that it tells you exactly how characters are saying something, how they're breathing, where they're looking, how they're moving. So it's very sort of nuanced in this way, which was also new, this excessive new sort of use of stage demands, stage directions. But yeah, I think it's aimed at an audience, not at an audience, but at a reader first and foremost. And then later on, the play got rewritten by Schiller for other performances. It then got rewritten by other writers and directors who wanted to have their own version on stage. There was no such thing as copyright, so people could do that. So it exists, I think, in many variations.
No copyright and no royalties.
Yeah.
A play written by such a young writer and very bold writer makes me wonder, how did people react to this play when it was first performed at the time?
That's a really interesting question, and it ties back to what Steffi said earlier about how originally it had been published as what you'd call a Lesedrama, so a drama that was meant to be first and foremost read and not necessarily performed in front of an audience. So the fact that it had already been published in 1781 anonymously had started to create an anticipation about its eventual performance. And the premiere of the play happened in Mannheim in 1782, so a year after it had been published as a text, on the 13th of January, so in the depths of winter. But that didn't matter. People turned out, and it really caused a sensation. It made Schiller famous or infamous almost overnight. In fact, he actually attended the premiere with a friend of his, although he'd been forbidden to do so, and also reviewed the performance anonymously, criticizing the author for some weaknesses, which is interesting to think about how he was already critiquing his own work. So afterwards, the Duke Karl Eugen, who I mentioned earlier, actually had Schiller briefly imprisoned for having travelled to Mannheim without permission to attend the play, and also then tried to ban him from writing. So at that point, Schiller really had no choice but to escape. He went to Frankfurt, on to Weimar, where he eventually settled, and as Steffi mentioned earlier, would eventually die at the age of just 45 from tuberculosis in 1805. But to come back to the premiere, yeah, I think the public interest had really been heightened by the publication of the text a year earlier, and it was really creating a stir due to its criticism of the feudal system. In an attempt to diffuse some of this tension, the director and the producer of the play decided to set the action, I think, for the premiere about 300 years in the past, to create some sort of distance between now and then. Didn't necessarily work, not least because at least one of the performers was appearing on stage in contemporary dress. So there were all kinds of attempts to diffuse some of this tension that just kept building the anticipation of the performance of this play.
Yeah, so basically the play's premiere caused a complete scandal, and I have a quotation here from a contemporary witness report that says, "Das Theater glich einem Irrenhaus, rollende Augen, geballte Fäuste, heisere Aufschreie im Zuschauerraum. Fremde Menschen fielen einander schluchzend in die Arme, Frauen wankten, einer Ohnmacht nahe zur Tür." Es war eine allgemeine Auflösung wie ein Chaos, aus dessen Nebeln eine neue Schöpfung hervorbricht. So this means the theatre resembled a madhouse, rolling eyes, clenched fists, hoarse cries in the audience. Strangers fell into each other's arms, sobbing. Women staggered to the door, almost fainting. It was a general dissolution, like chaos, from whose mists a new creation emerged. So in a way, this isn't just a comment on how the play went down with the audience, but also there is very early on this idea of a general chaos out of which something new, the sort of the mists of this chaos, something new, a new creation emerges, sort of theatrically as well, in the way that Schiller did theatre, borrowed from different conventions, materials, and so on.
That's right. I mean, I think it's definitely not the case that this play inspired a revolution or riots in the street necessarily or something like that, but it certainly was revolutionizing the way that theatre was done.
Thank you very much. This was a fascinating conversation. Makes me want to reread it again, I think. Thank you.